The old woman's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the train like something sharp and urgent. "Don't drink the water," she said, and Katya froze, her fingers tightening around the glass as her heart skipped in confusion, because nothing about this moment had felt dangerous until now. Nothing at all. Just another long ride home. Just another day of trying to stay invisible. And yet the way the woman looked at her, with fear and certainty mixed together, made something deep inside her chest twist painfully. Katya had learned to ignore people, to lower her eyes, to stay quiet, because speaking had never helped her before. It had only made things worse, especially after everything that had happened at school. After the whispers, the laughter, the cruel jokes that teachers pretended not to hear, after being blamed for things she never did, after standing alone while others decided who she was allowed to be. So now she simply nodded faintly, unsure of everything, and stared at the glass of water as if it suddenly held answers she didn't understand. Across from her sat a man in an expensive suit, his presence heavy, his posture confident, the kind of man who never questioned anything because the world had always bent in his favor. He had been watching her for a while, though Katya tried not to notice, because people like him always noticed her first, always judged, always decided, and she had learned there was no winning against that kind of attention. The train rattled softly, the countryside passing in a blur outside the window, calm and distant, completely unaware of the tension growing inside this small compartment. And then, just a minute later, the old woman suddenly stood up, her movement abrupt, her eyes darting nervously toward the suited man, and without another word she walked away, disappearing into the next carriage as if she had never been there at all, leaving Katya alone with a warning that now felt heavier than the glass in her hands. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just silence, just the quiet hum of the train, and Katya almost convinced herself that it was nothing, that maybe the woman was confused, or unwell, or simply strange, because that would be easier to believe, easier than imagining something darker. But then the man across from her smiled, slow and cold, and leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers in a way that made her stomach tighten. "You should drink it," he said calmly, his voice smooth but firm, like someone used to being obeyed, and Katya felt that familiar helplessness creep in, the same feeling she had known so many times before, when people told her what to do and expected her to comply, when resistance felt pointless, when her voice felt too small to matter, and for a moment she almost lifted the glass, almost obeyed, just to avoid conflict, just to make everything easier. But then she remembered the old woman's eyes, the urgency, the fear, and something inside her refused, quietly but firmly. She shook her head, just a little, her voice barely audible as she said, "I'm not thirsty," and the man's smile faded, replaced by something sharper, something more dangerous, and the air between them seemed to grow colder. "Drink it," he repeated, this time with less patience, and Katya's heart began to race, because now it was clear, this was not a suggestion, this was a command, and she knew that tone, she had heard it before, from people who believed they had the right to control others, from people who never expected to be challenged, and for a second, fear almost won, almost pushed her to give in, but then she placed the glass back on the table, her hands trembling slightly, and looked down, refusing without saying another word. The man leaned back, slowly, studying her, his expression unreadable, and then he laughed quietly, as if amused by her defiance, as if this was some kind of game to him, and maybe it was, maybe everything was, because people like him didn't lose, they didn't face consequences, they simply moved through life taking what they wanted, leaving others to deal with the damage. Minutes passed, slow and heavy, each second stretching longer than the last, and Katya sat there, silent, her thoughts spinning, her chest tight with a mix of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name yet, maybe hope, small and fragile, but there, because she had said no, and that mattered, even if no one else noticed. The train began to slow, approaching the next station, and the man checked his watch, his expression shifting slightly, almost impatient now, and then, just as the train came to a stop, two uniformed officers entered the carriage, their presence sudden and authoritative, and the man's calm demeanor cracked for the first time. "Sir, we need you to come with us," one of them said firmly, and the man frowned, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed that way, clearly irritated. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he began, his voice rising, but the officers didn't hesitate, they moved closer, their tone unchanging, and something in their confidence made it clear that this time, his influence meant nothing. Katya watched in stunned silence as the situation unfolded, her mind struggling to catch up, and then she saw the old woman again, standing just behind the officers, her gaze steady, no longer fearful, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. The glass of water still sat on the table, untouched, and one of the officers carefully picked it up, sealing it in a small evidence bag, and the man's face turned pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by something else entirely, something closer to panic. "You don't understand," he said quickly, his voice losing its smooth confidence, but it was too late, the truth was already unraveling, and for once, he couldn't stop it. The officers led him away, his protests fading into the distance, and the carriage fell silent again, but this time, the silence felt different, lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been lifted. The old woman stepped closer to Katya, her expression gentle now, and sat down across from her. "You did well," she said softly, and Katya blinked, still trying to process everything. What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, and the woman sighed, her gaze briefly distant. "A man who thought he could get away with anything," she replied, "but not today." It turned out the old woman wasn't just a passenger, she had been watching him for weeks, working quietly with authorities, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment, and when she saw Katya, alone and vulnerable, she knew he might try something, she knew she had to act quickly, but she also knew she couldn't stop him alone, she needed proof, and Katya, without realizing it, had helped create that proof by refusing, by not drinking the water. Tears filled Katya's eyes, not from fear this time, but from something deeper, something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that maybe, just maybe, her voice mattered, even if it was quiet, even if it was just a small, no. The train began to move again, slowly pulling away from the station, and Katya looked out the window, the world passing by once more, but it didn't feel the same as before, something had shifted, something inside her had changed. She was still the same girl, still quiet, still carrying the weight of past hurts, but now there was something else too, something stronger, a quiet understanding that she didn't have to accept everything, that she could choose. Even in small ways, even when it was hard. The old woman smiled gently, as if she could see that change, and for the first time in a long while, Katya allowed herself a small, tentative smile in return, because sometimes, justice didn't come with loud victories or dramatic moments, sometimes it came quietly, in the space between fear and courage, in the simple act of refusing to give in, and as the train carried her forward, Katya held onto that feeling, letting it grow, letting it become something real, something lasting, something that no one could take away from her again.